Good evening and welcome to our Catholic Evangelization Outreach event. This is the first event of our fourth year, so we're really excited and so pleased that all of you have supported us so well the last 3 years. So the team and I just want to really thank you for your support, and we hope that you will continue to do so. Hopefully you are sharing your stories with each other, with family and friends, and with all the people that God brings into your path and nudges you to share your story. I want to extend a special welcome to anyone who is here for the first time. We hope you'll return and come to other CEO events. For anyone new to our church tonight, I just want to let you know that the restrooms are in the back corner to my left. Also, I want to remind you that all of the CEO events are recorded and they're on the St. Margaret Mary website, so you can look at any of them at any time at your leisure. And now I want to introduce our speaker, who is Father Jonathan Mark Erdman. He was ordained a priest on June 29, 2017, on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. Prior to this, he was an Episcopal priest for 12 years before he and his family converted to the Catholic Church, and that was in July of 2016. They came to Louisville in July of 2010. Father Erdman and his wife Andrea came to Louisville from New York City, where Father served as curate and youth minister at St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue. From 2010 to early 2016, he served as rector of Calvary Episcopal Church here in Louisville. Born in Mahoning Township, Pennsylvania in 1978, he is the son of an Episcopal priest. Father Erdman received his BA in psychology from the University of Missouri-Rolla in 2000, and his Master's of Divinity from Yale University Divinity School in 2004. In 2002, Jonathan married Andrea Lee Benson at Christ Church, Rolla, Missouri. They have 5 children. Sarah and Joseph were both born in New York City, and their twins Gabriel and Naomi and youngest son Joshua were born right here in Louisville. Andrea has served as Director of Volunteers for Episcopal Social Services of New York and has a Master of Social Work degree from St. Louis University. Father Jonathan is passionate about preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. He is committed to pastoral ministry and worship and in making the riches of the traditions of the church available, especially patrimony of the Anglican Catholic tradition. He is dedicated to faithful liturgy and making the love of Christ known in worship and in the outreach of the church. Will you please join me in welcoming Father Jonathan Erdman?
First, my apologies for needing to sit, and also knowing now that I'm being recorded, which I was told ahead of time. I know this can and will be used against me in the future. It's been a long road. My life in Christ, of course, began at my baptism long ago. But my mother is fond of telling a story when I was a young child. She found me sitting in the bishop's chair at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Mountjoy, Pennsylvania, this little tiny country church. And she looked at me and thought, oh, how sweet, or how fun, isn't interesting John's playing bishop. She came up and asked me what I was doing, and I still don't recall this story. But apparently my response was, instead of saying I'm playing bishop, I told her I'm sitting in God's lap. And that was the reason I was so happy. That is kind of a symbol and a story that kind of holds what my life of faith has been. through thick and thin through my life of faith. There's always been an abiding presence, an abiding knowledge of God's presence. And really, if I talk about what I can aspire, the best out of what I can aspire to be is to still be God's little boy. So faith has always been a part of my life. As was mentioned, I'm the son of an Episcopal priest. I am also the brother of an Episcopal priest. The life of the faith was essential to my family. I grew up around the altar. If you think of Samuel being given to the temple when he was young, that was kind of me. We were always serving. If my father needed added servers, you know how here they have to scrounge for people? It was always one of those. Dad would walk over, and in would come the boys to serve at the altar. And I remember watching my father preach, watching him teach, watching him lead, and how formative that was to me. And of course, it was with the countless trips at the hospital late at night or having to leave dinner. All these things were things that I became very versed in. And I benefited greatly from my father's ministry, from hearing his preaching and watching what he did. My mother as well has been critical to my life of faith. The stories I remember are the ones that she told while we sat around and she read to us. And her life supporting my father in his ministry has been something that's been very formative to me. And I always knew and always know that I have her love and her care. So that was kind of, my faith began. I kind of have two stories. It's kind of funny. I have the story of a convert and the story of one who began in the faith. I have both. There are two stories to my faith, and both are essential. And so, rooted in that faith, I grew up among a clergy household. I have two brothers. I joke I was raised by the dogs, but always had large dogs running around. But eventually, the first inkling I had of a call to the priesthood, and at first, of course, I thought it was the Episcopal priesthood. The first inkling of a call that I had was in my sophomore year of high school. And of course, this is the phase in life where everyone's trying to examine what they're going to do and where they're going to go and what's next. And everyone asks the question in one specific way usually, which is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I remember I had a world history teacher who asked the question differently. And instead, what do you see yourself doing when you're older? And I remember my first response was priest in my head at that response, and I thought, oh, heavens no. And it took a little while to kind of fight through that. But like many call narratives, the first time I experienced a call, like Moses, there was an excuse, I can't talk well enough. Like Jeremiah, I'm too young. St. Peter said, I'm a sinful man, go away from me, O Lord. And so my first response was to push back just a little bit. I think part of that might have also been because I knew what it would entail. I knew some of what that life would bring, or so I thought. One can never, and that's part of also the theme of what God has been for me in my life, is that his dreams for me have always been more than what I thought they would be. I've had my idea, and God has had his. So I graduated high school, and unlike most people, I did not move away from home. Home moved away from me. I stayed in Rolla, Missouri, and I made a few shortcuts here. I should get myself from Pennsylvania to Rolla. My father, being an Episcopal priest, moved around. Whereas most Catholic priests stay in one place, Episcopal priests tend to kind of move around the country. And so I started in Pennsylvania, landed in Missouri. So 2 places in Pennsylvania, 1 in Missouri. In a small town in the middle of a state that were you to throw a dart and hit the bullseye of Missouri, that's where I was. That's Rolla, Missouri. The town motto was in the middle of everywhere. I think you can think how we referred to it when we were in high school. In the middle of nowhere. Town was about 2 hours away, but it was a good place to grow up. But then I remained in Rolla for college, and my parents, again, being an Episcopal priest, moved to Joplin, Missouri. And so I went through undergraduate there, and all throughout undergraduate, I kind of understood that what I was doing was preparing for priesthood. And so I chose psychology and literature as my major and minor intentionally, asking my father, Dad, should I take religion in my undergrad? Or he said, no, something else, either philosophy or something else, that would be useful in your priestly studies. He said, you'll get enough formation in seminary. And so psychology and literature at an engineering school was quite an interesting place to be. I was maybe one of 80 psychology majors on a campus of over 6,000. We were an embattled minority. There was the engineering discipline buildings for every different group. We had the humanities, social sciences building. So they crammed everything into one. But even throughout high school and college, I would do things like lead Bible studies. I even in my fraternity house, when I was in Lambda Chi Alpha, I had a Bible study that I led once a week. And it was never the guys you thought that would show up or the ones that were there. It was always the ones that kind of followed Jesus' model of seeking and saving the lost. It was always the ones you'd think would be least interested were the ones that happened to come by the most faithfully. But all throughout that time, I was preparing, I was studying. It was also in college that I met my wife, Andrea. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that was one of the momentous moments in my life of faith. I have learned a great deal from the sacrament of marriage. And I will say without question, my understanding of the cross of Jesus as sacrifice for the church and for his spouse, the church, is something that has been profoundly shaped by my marriage to my wife. And though she can't be here tonight because she's supporting me somewhere else, her support has been critical and essential to me in my life of ministry. So we met working on a literary magazine in an engineering school, which was always an interesting place to have met. And through many years of courtship, we ended up deciding to get engaged. And that story is rather funny, actually. In the Episcopal Church, it used to be that bishops had to give permission for seminarians to get married. It's fairly reasonable. That's no longer the case, but the good seminarians all know that they're supposed to write and ask permission anyway. And so, of course, that's what I did. And we had a new bishop who didn't understand how the system worked. And so he sent a letter to us saying, and he's embarrassed about this now, but sending a letter to us saying, that's wonderful, I'm excited for you, you've met this wonderful woman. Before you make any important decisions, please meet with me so that I can offer the appropriate pastoral support. Well, being a faithful seminarian, I assumed that that was a pretty big decision to get engaged, so I shouldn't do it. And so we ended up talking for about 6 months of, were you to get married on August 10th in Rolla, Missouri? What color might you want for the, that was a conversation, and there was and so we eventually ended up in the bishop's office, and he was embarrassed to find out we weren't already engaged. So his face turned about as red as your shirt, so he was fairly embarrassed that was the case. We were engaged later that day. But we got married, and basically, Andrea supported me through an internship in Nebraska, a long-distance relationship for 2 years. We got married after my first year in seminary. Seminary was a good time for me, and also a hard time for me. And so all throughout this time, the influence of my brothers, my friends, was all very critical in my life of faith. And again, there's a certain part of my life that is very much like a strong building current, and there's that part that's going to come up eventually where things suddenly shift. And I think both are important. So in seminary, it was a good time and it was a hard time. I found the classes engaging. I loved discussing my faith. I loved that at Yale Divinity School you had people from every denomination, every different ecclesial community, and some who had none. You had just pretty much everybody. But it was still a community where the majority of people believed in the gospel of Christ. So in a very rigorous academic environment, I loved it. But I also found it was really in that time in seminary where more and more of what was starting to trouble me in my Episcopal life started to come to the forefront. So I loved the classes, I enjoyed the engagement, and even met some very good friends that are still my friends today. But it was in seminary also where I started to come into contact where a tradition I had been raised to look to for tradition, for reason, and for Scripture as the central foundations of the faith of Anglicanism. I started to see those things being wandered away from more and more in seminary. And that was hard for me. And I don't say this, I barely think of it now, except when I'm telling my story. But when I was there, one of the harder moments for me that kind of crystallizes a lot of it, there are actually two, One of the moments that was very hard for me was shortly after 2003, when the Episcopal Church ordained its first bishop that was in a same-sex marriage. And the bishop came to preach. And I remember him beginning his sermon saying, "I don't like the Gospel of John." That still echoes in my ears. I don't like the Gospel of John. Jesus in John has things too figured out. And the Jesus I believe in still struggles with things. Now, this deeply troubled me. I went and talked to the seminary dean about it, the Episcopal dean, talking about how it did trouble me because I saw it as completely backwards. That it's not about who I do not craft Jesus in my image. It is me who is made in God's image. And so I found that deeply troubling. And I began to be deeply troubled about how far I saw things wandering from Scripture, from tradition, and from reason. I also saw that there, and by no means everyone, and I don't want to give a negative effect on my understanding of the Episcopal Church because, quite frankly, it taught me to long for what was right. The trouble is, I didn't see it living up to what it taught me to long for. And so it taught me to long for a deep understanding of the sacraments. It taught me to long for a faith that required reason. It taught me to long for a faith that was rooted in tradition and apostolic succession. But I saw all these things starting to fall away and be less important, not only by students, but also by seminary, also by professors, others. And it became to be something that started to trouble me. But also by other faithful Episcopalians in the seminary, I was buttressed. And I started taking my battle line from a man named John Keble, who was one of the Oxford Divines. And John Keble said, and I found this felt very noble back in my 2003 younger self. He said, "Were the Church of England to fail, it would yet be found in my parish." And so for me, that was what I was going to do. I was going to be the guy who had the cap with it embroidered on it, the cape with it on it, and probably the T-shirt too, that said, "Church of England to fail, to yet be found in my parish." Because this is the tradition I grew up in. This is the tradition my father taught me. This is the tradition of my family. And there was and is very much good in it. And I was like, doggone it, I'm going to be the standard bearer for this. It's going to happen. And so I graduated seminary and was placed first at a church in suburban St. Louis. And all throughout my time as an Episcopal priest, I always kind of struggled with that balance between what I heard people doing around me and what I felt drawn to. But I understood myself as someone who was staying there to hold, in a sense, hold the fort, to teach people to be, in some ways, even a missionary. I found any number of ways to try and grapple with it. And I believe that the work I did was very good work as an Episcopal priest. But at the same time, there was always this constant nagging, this constant longing, this tiny little thing that I would always distract myself from in many myriads of different ways. I'd have this little bit of a longing, like I'd see something that the Catholic Church put out and go, "That's exactly right. Why couldn't we say something that clear?" Or I'd hear of something the Catholic Church was doing and think, "That's wonderful. I'd like to be a part of that, but no, I have people here." And you see, what I would always do is find a way to move myself somewhere else. I would always find a way to come back to where I was, not where I know now God was trying to lead me all along. Now, one of the most formative places for me came next, and that was New York City, when I served at a church called St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, which is a church that has a choir of men and boys. It is a church that has an amazing choral program. And I fell in love with choral music there. Absolutely fell in love with it. It was a church where you could hear, walking out of your apartment in the morning, you'd hear English choir boys rehearsing. So you'd walk outside and you get this wonderful contrast between beautiful sacred music, and then you step out onto the streets of New York. It was a bit of a difference. But it did buttress you as you went out your day. But it was there I really came to understand, not only understanding the faith through my head and through my heart, because there was that too, but also the profound understanding of understanding our faith through beauty. That beauty was such a critical part of what it means to be a person of faith. And it's such an important part of the gospel. Indeed, the words for good and beauty are the same in Greek. It's kalos. Good and beauty are the same word. And this is a place where I fell in love with the high church tradition. I fell in love with much more of the Catholic side of the Episcopal Church at that time. And that was very formative to me. And it was something that, I'd always felt drawn that way. I was always the strange little kid that always enjoyed, there were two forms in the Episcopal Church. There was the language that was the called Rite One, which is the Elizabethan language with lots of these, thys, and thous, which is why also if you hear me drop an errant, we beseech thee on you, that's why it happened. I was always drawn to that over the more contemporary language. Not that I thought either were bad, I loved them both. And I do think it's very important that you hear in this whole talk, I still love people in the Episcopal Church much. My brother and father are still priests in good standing there. And I think they're doing good work for the gospel. The only reason I bring up these things is to show you where God led me and how. So I fell in love with the beauty of the church. It's also in New York where we had my first child. And it was something that profoundly changed my life of faith. Because for me at that moment, I came to understand, as much as I loved this little girl I was holding in my hands, God loved her infinitely more than I loved her. And that God loved me infinitely more than I loved her. And that too became one of the most beautiful things in my faith. That mystery of love that has one of the prayers that we have in our morning prayer, that inestimable love of God that cannot be measured or numbered. And so that for me has been very profound in my life of faith. It is also in New York where my wife and I lost a child about halfway through the pregnancy. And her name was Abigail. And that too has been one of the more profound moments in my life of faith. Abigail means my father's joy. And Andrea, to her credit, would not let me change the name. I wanted to go liturgically melodramatic and name the child Mara, which means bitter, like in Ruth. I kind of wanted to pull off one of those. But I am grateful that we kept her name. Because in my grief, I had thought that there was no way, how could she be my joy? I wouldn't know her. I would never get to hold her. I wouldn't get to know her. And a good and godly man whose children are both Catholics now, and he said he's perfectly fine with it, although he is still an Episcopal priest, spoke with me. And as I was speaking with him, he said something that completely transformed, and of course I knew it intellectually but hadn't thought about it. I said, Victor, I've been praying for her every day. And he said to me in a very quiet and saintly voice, and now she's praying for you. And I broke down. Because the little girl who I thought I had lost completely, of course, remembering in the communion of saints, of course I hadn't lost her, because she is in Christ and so am I. And now the little girl that I wanted to care for in one way now prays for me. It also helped me understand that when we talk about grief in our faith, I understood Paul's words when he says, we do not grieve as one without hope, but we learn to grieve as those with hope. And there's a difference. It's not that we don't grieve, but it's we don't grieve as those without hope. And so shortly thereafter, or sometime thereafter actually, my son Joseph was born. And in my mind, that was great. Okay, God, I've done my part. I've been hopeful. I've grieved as one with hope, right? I've had one more child even after that. Done my part. Thank you, God. We have all the children we need. I think you all know where this is going to go. We'll get back to that one. So there I go with my perfectly sized family of 2 children, a dog and a cat. And I get a call to serve a church in Louisville, Kentucky. Calvary Episcopal Church, which is also beautiful music tradition, beautiful building. And I get a call to go serve as their priest. And I know they have a few things they're also working on. They'd had a long-standing priest for many years. At one point, there were a few things the parish needed to work on, but really good people. And so I left the job that I very much loved, very much enjoyed, to go work in Louisville, Kentucky, a place I'd never been, people I'd never seen. And I should also mention the Episcopal Church's deployment system works a bit differently. It kind of works like a dating service, the priest, which I actually have no direct experience with, but you fill out your own profile of what you're like, and the church fills out their profile. You say things like, I enjoy long liturgies by candlelight, long processions around the church, things like that, I love love stories like the Gospels. You tell what type of priest you are, and the church tells what type of church they are, and they try and match you up. And then the two decide among themselves. And so, I decided I'd take a few long liturgies by candlelight with Calvary, and ended up here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I would be remiss, this is why I have notes, but I avoid using them from time to time. I do sometimes miss broad strokes. One of the things that is a central point to this was what happened before New York. Just before New York, on my call to go there were two different opportunities of call. I was offered a small church. I would have been pastor in the rural Midwest, which is, hey, my father was pastor in the rural Midwest. It's kind of what I saw myself doing, right? What my idea was. And so there was a church that wanted me very much, down to the fact that they put me up in a bed and breakfast that had a white picket fence. It was that stereotypical of what I thought I'd be called to, okay? And then there's the absolute opposite. St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue, New York City. I thought I would be pastor in charge of a small church in the rural Midwest. I was a curate and assistant at a large church in the middle of America's mall, in the middle of Fifth Avenue, New York. And I certainly wasn't a priest in charge. And yet, it couldn't have been better. And this is the central theme in what I'm trying to talk about today, is that God's dreams for us are more than ours for ourselves. Now, it took me a whole week to figure it out, that I was called to go to this church in New York, when most Episcopal priests that I knew in seminary would have been like, St. Thomas, yes, we'll go there now. But it took me a solid week. Now, to be honest, Andrea knew I would go there probably within 2 days of my discernment. I'm struggling through this whole thing. And she knows 2 days in, you're going to New York. And sure enough, in the end, that is where my prayer and discernment led me. And of course, it led me on my path here. If I hadn't gone to New York, I don't know that, actually, I know I wouldn't have been here. It's where I got to know priests in the Catholic tradition, albeit priests still within the Episcopal Church, but priests that were much more formed by the Catholic tradition. And it's where I met several of them. And so that was, again, greater than I could have hoped. I had no idea what my life would bring. And so getting ready to pack my perfectly sized family, 2 children, dog and a cat. Of course, the second son, my son is only a month old now, and drive in a minivan from New York City with a dog and a cat and 2 children, all the way across the country, all the way to Louisville, Kentucky. And just before I leave, the priest, who is still a good friend and I still consider a mentor, asked me if I had a crucifix for my office. And I didn't. I had a cross with the Lord's Prayer on it, but I didn't have a crucifix. And Father Meade, who'd become a dear father in faith to me, takes the cross off his office and hands it to me. And I take that with me to Louisville, Kentucky. It now hangs in my living room, and I'll explain why, and not in my office here. And that's an important moment later. So we jet off to Kentucky. And for many years, my time at Calvary went very, very well. Good people, some things to work out, as any parish does, but things went well. But what ended up happening eventually is the Episcopal Church changed its canons on marriage. And there was intended to be a conscience clause where a priest could decide not to allow or to do same-sex marriages in their parish. Now, See, I should use my notes. I keep jumping ahead. We'll get there. As I'm at Calvary, there were tons of times where there were lots of things that kept drawing me to the Catholic Church. I remember specifically one moment, and this is one of the moments where I realized maybe I should think about something, but I quickly pulled myself aside. I was in an Episcopal rector's office, looking at my computer in rapt prayer for the election of the next pope. So here I am in an Episcopal priest's office, watching all the coverage of the election going on for Pope Francis, praying earnestly for the election, again in an Episcopal priest's office. And then I remember, rejoicing when he was elected and thinking a few days later, when I saw, and this is one of the best Facebook moments of evangelization I've ever seen. And it was very simple. Someone posted a picture of all the faithful in St. Peter's Square, which I'd just seen a few days earlier. I can't recall if they're holding candles. If they weren't, they should have been, because the beauty of it was something there for me. And a simple statement on it is, this is my church. Come worship Jesus with us. And the first response was yes. You remember how my call to priesthood went the first time? My first response was yes. My second response was, but wait. I have people to care for in the Episcopal Church, where the Church of England to fail yet be found, and Calvary Episcopal Church in Louisville, Kentucky, now in my parish. And of course, I did what I could to push it aside and continue my work. Now, let's fast forward a few years later. We'd been growing quite nicely. We'd built a strong music program that built on the back of a wonderful music program beforehand. Beautiful liturgy at the parish. But then when the church changed its marriage canons, now we're getting back down to me with my banner, my cap, and my, shirt. Where church began to fail, yet be found here. So, I took my moment to, and I didn't seek out a conflict. It sought me out. The very day, the first Sunday, I was a day away from my summer vacation. I used to take the whole month of July. I was one day away from escape. One day away from having to deal with it. One day. Actually, I was 1 hour away from having to deal with it. It was the last service of the day. We've already done 2 masses, getting ready for the last one. It's over. And I'm in that mode where I'm almost out the door. I'm in the exit way. I'm in the space that if I just get 10 more feet, 10, I'd be off to vacation for July and not have to worry about it. And a couple that I've been doing pastoral care with comes up and talks to me, and not for any reason malicious, but because they loved me and I loved them. Came up to me and said, "Father, we'd like you to do our wedding." I didn't get a vacation that summer. It was a hard summer. And I don't want to rehash all of the battles and things that went on. Needless to say, a lot of good people have a very hard time dealing with conflict, especially when they consider the stakes to be high, and especially when there are some very many different senses of what people believe to be right and wrong. And if you ask an Episcopalian what they believe, the joke was, if there are 3 Episcopalians in the room, there'll be 5 beliefs. Okay? And we really wouldn't argue. We wouldn't have argued with that when we were Episcopalian. There'd be, you could see it this way, and you might look at it this way. But when you're in that environment, it can become very hard, especially when things start to hit. And even though I'd warned some members of the parish before, in that long process of long processions by the beach, that kind of thing, when I talked about who I was as a priest, either that was missed or misunderstood, or they thought, surely he's a young man and he'll clearly see reason should the whole church do so. The long and the short of it was, over about 6 months, a fairly prolonged process in time, I came to the conclusion that basically the conscience clause wasn't going to hold. There were some strong signs that it wasn't going to. And the choice came really whether or not I was going to have my family say goodbye to the church once or twice. And I wasn't willing to let it be twice. And so I came to the conclusion that I needed to resign my position as the pastor of that parish and then try and figure out what on earth I was going to do with my life after that. Now, I wasn't going to resign my orders in the Episcopal Church. That wasn't the plan. But I came to the conclusion that I needed to resign. And through some bitter tears, I eventually did. Now, you'll find this next part amusing. In my resignation letter, I quoted Martin Luther. To show you where I was still coming from. Martin Luther's wonderful, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That was, Again, I had the hat, I had the cape, I had the t-shirt. I was bound and determined to be that hero. And that wasn't what it was about. It wasn't what it was ever meant to be. And so then I started serving at the altar of St. Francis in the Fields Episcopal Church here, just kind of so I had an altar to be attached to. And started trying to discern where I would go next. And really, in a sense, there were a variety of things that kind of came up. There was a wonderful Anglo-Catholic church, and that term, just to describe what it means. Anglo-Catholic is still Episcopalian, but it's about as nosebleed high as it can get. I mean, we're talking really high, okay? And so there was a wonderful church that had a wonderful, faithful, Orthodox rector who was the pastor there. I would have been working underneath him as his assistant. As the chaplain of an elite private school, $14,000 a year tuition for all my kids, comped. Oh, I missed something. I'll get there. Would have been great. Would have been perfect. Would have been out of the battle. Not the man in charge, behind someone else. Perfect way to remain Episcopalian if I chose to. So that was coming. But in the midst of all the things going on at Calvary, something else happened before I got to that other point. Despite doing everything now that I would say is very much against church teaching. I remember I said I was comfortable with the perfect-sized family I had. I was. My idea was great. I thought it was, at least. How wrong I was. Despite being fully uncontracepted, all of a sudden we find out we're expecting a baby. Now, I looked up, thought, really? This was not my plan. And of course, the first movement in my mind, I was terrified. And then we go to the ultrasound, and not only is there one, but there are two. It was great fun calling my parents and saying, yes, the ultrasound went well, the babies are fine. And waiting for them to catch on that it was plural, which they didn't take them that long. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, we found out that the same condition that had caused Abigail's loss was present with the two of them. It was a small bleed that was present. And I looked up and I'm like, really? Not again. I'm not doing this again. And my greatest hope, I realized, that I was just, praying earnestly for the safety of the kids. Ended up having to lead the parish through some time of conflict, as well as now my wife is on absolute bed rest. So now I have 2 kids, now 2 dogs and a cat, I think, at this point. I can't remember when no, still 1 dog. And the cat, and a parish, and a wife on bed rest. And did all of that. Now, due to God's wonderful grace, of course, many of you have met Gabriel and Naomi. Both of them were born healthy. And if I had had my way, and I feel so sad about this. If my dreams had been what had happened, they wouldn't be here. And yet, what profound blessing they have been. And how God dragged me into life kicking and screaming. And of course, how many people base their decisions in life on fear? And I'm so grateful that my fear is not what determined the course of my life. It's another place where God's dream for me was bigger than mine. I was comfortable, and by comfortable I meant comfortably afraid in the size of my family. And then now I had two more. And thanks be to God for it, because that was also something that helped me understand the church's message about life. So I didn't understand it. How would I? It had never been taught to me, really. You think about it, I mean, I've always been pro-life. Down to the point of, annoying high school friends about it, down to the point of, in seminary getting tagged as, that conservative guy. I was always pro-life, but I never understood the church's full witness to life. And I will say without a doubt, Naomi and Gabriel's birth is a central part of my conversion. Because here I felt I was closed off out of fear. And God blessed me well with more than I deserve. And so, now let me get back to North Carolina. See what this? I joke I have a personality of an absent-minded professor, just absent the professor. And so I tend to wander a trifle bit. But will find myself discerning where on earth to go. And it quickly ends up being, I meet this church in North Carolina, and at the same time, a member of my church of Calvary goes to St. Martin of Tours and sits behind 2 out of the 3 ordinariate Catholics in the city of Louisville. Okay, there are only 3 that were there at the time. Now we've got about 26 that are actually officially registered. 41 in the community, but we'll talk later. But sits behind this couple. And if I say to you right now, the Lord be with you, your response is? Does anyone know what response I'd be used to as an Episcopalian in Rite 1? And with thy spirit. And so what happens? This member of my congregation who at St. Martin of Tours, sitting behind this couple, hears the priest say, the Lord be with you. And she responds, and with thy spirit. They hear her. And they talk with her after Mass. That small difference in the liturgy is one of the ways in which I got put in touch with Father Beach at St. Martin's. Because this couple were ordinary Catholics. They talk with her because, of course, it's kind of like a code. If we hear anyone do that in a Catholic church, we're like, oh, you're one of ours. We know who you are. And so, they knew either she was Episcopalian or was at some point. And so spoke with her, and eventually I got introduced to them. And so I started discerning between conversations with them and with Father Beach. It very quickly became not whether or not I was going to go to this church in North Carolina, but whether or not I was going to remain Episcopalian and go to this church in North Carolina or become Catholic. And the discernment was interesting because at the same time, a community had formed in my living room. Remember I mentioned that cross being in my living room? That crucifix in my living room? Well, some folks from Calvary hadn't seen each other for a while and decided they wanted to get together for, at some point. So we said, well, hey, how about we come over to my house? We'll do a potluck, and I'll say Mass in my living room. And so we rearranged the whole living room to now function like a chapel. So the couch turns into collegiate-style seating, and, we got everything arranged. Set up a little altar, and the crucifix now takes front and center above it. And we decided we liked gathering so much we'd keep doing it. The second week, we're like, this is great. Let's keep doing it. And so slowly and slowly, that little group that met in my living room eventually became what is now Our Lady in St. John community, which is the other community I serve. So we're all discerning. The community is discerning as a whole. I'm discerning as a priest. We've got people who have been evangelicals. We've got people who have been Lutherans. We have people who have been Presbyterian pastors. We've got people who've been from pretty much every walk of every ecclesial community you might think of. My wife would joke that she included all of them in her upbringing. She was catechized Catholic, baptized Methodist. That's another story. And is now Catholic. Finally got her. So I begin discerning. Andrea and I, take the work, since I don't have a current job at the time, my work is discernment. And so due to Ryan and Diana, who are the ordinary Catholics that were there, and their library, I was able to answer so many of the questions that I'd had. I'd ask a question, the line they used to say there's an app for that? They had 3 books for that. Whatever the question would be, if it was about magisterial teaching and what that meant, they had 3 books for that. And Ryan, also good lay Dominican that he is, had it underlined, had post-it notes, had turn here, 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 and here. Or documents of Vatican II underlined and pointed out where I would find things that would help answer my questions. So between his help and also, any number of things, I eventually started to really strongly feel drawn toward the Catholic Church, and it became so much less about what I felt I was leaving and more what I felt drawn to, as I had all my life in those other moments. But there was that one moment, you remember I quoted Martin Luther in my exit letter? I wasn't going to go without a fight. And at one point I'm like, all right, that's it. I'm going to take on everything I've always had a problem with in the Catholic Church. I'm picking up the catechism and I'm going to read it. And I'm going to find what my Protestant self, which I never would have admitted I was a Protestant until probably about that point, what my Protestant self wants to find. So I'm like, all right, what's all this merit stuff Luther preached against? Merit. I'm going to find it. Flip, 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 flip. Merit. Not possible without grace. Oh, crud. They've read Augustine too. I went through and it went like that time and time again, that what I thought I understood the church to believe, even having, throughout the entirety of my 12 years as an Episcopal priest, tried to say and defend Catholic teaching to other people, say that's not what the church believes. I remember when I first got to a parish, they had these awful pamphlets in the front that was there, I believe it was something entitled An Episcopalian's Understanding of the Holy Eucharist for those who are Roman Catholic or those who used to be Roman Catholic. And I flip in it and I see something saying, what is it? This is speaking, of course, on the Episcopal Church's voice. We believe the Holy Eucharist is God's gift to all, not the Church's gift to some. And I'm like, sigh. The Catholic Church doesn't believe that. Throw those away. And so I would always sift the track rack anytime I went anywhere. So even as someone who regularly felt myself a defender of things Catholic, I didn't realize how much my formation had been through the lens of Protestant polemics. I understood myself as being a fairly Catholic Episcopalian. I didn't realize how much I didn't know. And so I'm rifling through the catechism. And one by one, as I go through it, the things I thought I had problems with had been dealt with. To my great frustration and to my joy. It was a little bit of both. And so, again, having now understood myself being a little more Protestant than I thought, what's the next place I'm going to look if I'm looking for a church that's an apostolic succession with valid sacraments? Any thoughts? Where am I looking next if I'm not looking Catholic? Orthodoxy. That's right. That's the first place I was going to go look. And I love the Orthodox liturgy, without a doubt. But at the same exact time, I am reading Pope Benedict's chapter of Called to Communion on the importance of the papacy for maintaining unity in the church and the role of the successor of Peter. At the same time, Orthodoxy has been planning their 15-year planned synod that they were going to do, bringing all of Orthodoxy together. And because of a jurisdictional dispute, I think 2 weeks from the council they were going to have, 1/3 of the Orthodox world decides not to show up that day. And I understand that's how they work out their issues. I'm not critiquing that necessarily. But as I'm looking for and feeling drawn to the unity of the church, as I'm reading this passage about the importance of Peter, I see Second Rome and Third Rome fighting about who gets to be Rome, and I'm thinking, well, Rome's still there. Rome's always been there. And I read that chapter in Pope Benedict's book in a wonderful way, It was the first time I'd had the papacy explained to me in a way that wasn't really trying to force me to get to the conclusion too quickly. Cardinal Ratzinger just very gently led through it in the determination of a German professor. It was one of those, we'll get there, be patient, and just systematically walk through. He said, we'll get to all the Bible passages you've heard. We'll get to everything you've heard before, but there's more of a foundation you need, not only on what the papacy is, but what on the entirety of the church is. And I found myself becoming more and more drawn to the Catholic Church. And then finally, a few small things made the difference. Not the whole difference, but helped push me that way. The priest I was interviewing with in North Carolina said to me at one point, well, Jonathan, you know that some of us, myself sometimes included, wonder if maybe Anglicanism was only ever true on paper. It's a very hard thing for someone who's been 12 years an Episcopal priest, much less a priest who's been a priest over 30 years, like he was, to say it. Because he knew what I was discerning. He knew at that point the choice was now not between whether or not I'd serve in his church, whether I'd stay Episcopalian and come there or become Catholic. The other thing he also said is that you have to face it, Jonathan, that the Anglo-Catholic parishes have had to be Congregationalist to survive. And he's right. I mean, back in the day in the Episcopal Church, when if you put candles on the altar, you could lose your holy orders. Yeah, you kind of had to do your own thing. And so the Anglo-Catholic part of the Episcopal Church has always kind of been very central in their parishes. And I realized that what I was seeking to do was to be Congregationalist for the sake of Catholic unity, which didn't make sense to me. And so I tell Father Beach that I'm willing to have the Vicar General of the Ordinariate come and speak to my community. And so then Bishop Stephen Lopes, who's my current bishop, sends his Vicar General up for what I now find is his first community visit. We were his first visit. He did very well. You never would have known it. But Father Perkins, who had been an Episcopal priest and was now the Ordinariate's Vicar General, comes up and visits with our community. And we have several long talks. And I remember after that meeting just being so taken with the simple straightforwardness of his faith. Because so many of my questions were about, how is God going to do this? How am I going to plan for this? How is this going to happen? You know, I have 4 kids. How is my family going to be fed? And of course, my wife asked those questions too. She's very practical. She's the social worker. She's supposed to be practical. And Father Perkins just had such a profound sense of faith as one who'd been through it. He was among the first of the group to go through. And he had such a strong confidence of faith that God would just take care of it. And in a sense, asked us to step out in faith. And I never realized until that moment how much of my life had been under my own control. I'd taken lots of steps in faith, and they all prepared me for this one. But how much of my life I'd been trying to control myself. Even my construction of what I thought the Episcopal Church to be was my own. It was my own understanding of what liturgy should look like. And whenever there isn't a central teaching authority, I didn't realize how much of it was a faith I put in my own making. The parts of the Bible that I wanted to hold to. Even though I didn't think so, it was still my own judgment that did it. Not a higher judgment. It was still my best guess, my best understanding. And one of the things that kind of gave way to that, too, was a funny question that was, or actually the question was serious. The answer was not trying to be funny, but it was. We all kind of got a chuckle out of it. Someone very good-naturedly asks Father Perkins, what is the difference in the Catholic view on the Eucharist and the Episcopal view? And I promise he wasn't trying to be funny. He said, well, which Episcopal view? And we all laughed because we just realized that's one of the central differences. Is that there were, at the one parish I served, you had one priest who was a memorialist, one priest who believed in consubstantiation, and one person who was transubstantiationist. In the same parish. And so that was one of the big changes. Oh, Oh, yeah. And the long and the short of it is, after many months of discussion, lots of prayer and discernment, my wife and I decided to join the Catholic Church. And Our Lady in St. John, about half of the members, little over half, decided to become Catholic. And so my family was confirmed and received first. And part of it was just that burning desire to get to the Eucharistic table. Once I was in, I was in. And it had to be knowing that I could potentially remain a Catholic layman, and I was all right with that. As I found very quickly, I felt more able to speak for my faith in that capacity than I had in my 12 years. Now again, that is not in any way looking down on my 12 years as an Episcopal priest. The Anglican Church taught me what to long for. It taught me to long for a faith rooted in sacrament, in Scripture, in reason, in tradition, and rooted in history. But I found it here. I found it here. And in the beauty of the faith. And so then I'll make a long story short because I'm probably running over time, and I don't know what the time limit is here. But I can go on and on. It's a sad thing. Just ask my kids. Daddy can be long-winded. I began training as a Catholic priest at St. Meinrad. Wrote a long dossier, and some of this is from it. This much to be sent to the Vatican for my dispensation so I could be ordained as a married man. Eventually was given permission to be ordained, served as the facility manager at the Archdiocese's Flagey Center. I had no idea how I was going to eat. Within a week of becoming Catholic, I had a job. The church took care for me and for my family in a way that I never expected it to be able to do. I mean, just every time we were in need, something came up. And it wasn't even necessarily intentionally coordinated. Like at one point, a $500 bill came up. We told no one about it. We were struggling with how to deal with it. All of a sudden, a random $500 check comes to us. The food budget's running a little tight as we're trying to make do. Someone says, we got a deer, would you like it? My family eats venison stew. And it has been that way since we've become Catholic. To the point now where that statement where Jesus says, worry not about what you will eat or what you will wear. It's just, well, that's kind of the way we live now. And it's worked. Father Perkins' simple step out in faith has been true. But I have found such a beauty in the Catholic faith, in the rich variety of it, and how it met all the longings, all the things that I was raised to long for. You know, and it's one of those things that in feeling I wanted to carry on the faith that I was given by my parents, I came to realize the way to do that most fully and completely is in the Catholic Church. That the way to carry on the faith my parents gave me, even though they themselves right now are not Catholic, was to be a Catholic man. Now, I do make the joke that, and my brother would argue with me, so Nathan, if you're watching the tape, have fun. I do joke that my father and my brother support my call for two different reasons. My father because he believes it's what I am called to, and my brother Nathan because he believes it's what I believe I'm called to. But he would say there's more nuance to it than that. But to tell a good joke, sometimes you have to remove nuance. But I also firmly believe, and even talking with my family and my friends, who are still dear friends that are Episcopalian, that I have not gone further from them. I have not gone away from them in becoming Catholic. But I referenced Father Newhouse, who said when he left the Lutheran Church that he was drawing closer to his Lord Christ Jesus. And through doing so, drawing close to all those who love him. And so even though I'm no longer in Eucharistic communion with my father and my brother and my mother, I do believe I am closer to them and that I am closer to my Lord. But I will say without a doubt, the joy I have found in being a Catholic priest has been profound. I have never understood the great grace of the sacrament of confession and reconciliation and seeing hearts changed and transformed. I have never understood the profound joy of the sacrament expressed in every different type of Catholic church. You know, in certain places I'd been, it was only the kind of particularly high church folks that seemed to have that reverence. In the Catholic Church, I have found people of every stripe, every different kind of music, every worship style, but one of the things I have seen that is still profound to me is the reverence for the sacrament of the Lord's body and blood. And that's been amazing. And seeing the rich variety of what the church brings. The fact that I'm in a liturgy that is somewhere halfway between the Latin form, the ordinary form, as if Shakespeare wrote it, is basically what the ordinary form looks like. And yet I'm welcomed into the Catholic Church with open arms and greeted by the graciousness of a church that is truly Catholic and universal. And I give profound thanks every day that even as a married man, I'm able to serve my Lord in this capacity. And I am grateful for all that God has given me. There's a passage in Isaiah, which I'm going to use to summarize everything. And of course, any one story can't take all the twists and turns. And before I get to Isaiah, a few things I want really clearly to come out in this. I still love the Episcopal Church. I still love the people I served. I still love the people who raised me and raised me up as a man of faith. And I believe God has been calling me throughout that whole time. But I also believe that God has called me to the fullness of the truth in the Catholic Church. And that all the things that were good in Episcopalianism taught me to long for this. And obviously, as one whose job it is to continue to spread the Catholic faith, especially among those who aren't of it, I continue to long that others may find what I've found here. But I want it to be very clear, I am not bitter. I am not upset. At one point I was. That went away with the beauty of the faith. And I was able to easily forgive, for the sake of Christ, all that had happened, for the beauty of what he has done for me. But that passage in Isaiah, the prophet is speaking to the people of Israel, talking to them about their dreams. They've been in exile. They've been fighting a battle. Their greatest hope is they might just one day get back to where they were. Their greatest hope is to get back to the glory days. And Isaiah tells the people, God tells the people through Isaiah, it is too light a thing for you to go and restore my people Israel. But I will make you a light to the nations that my glory may reach to the ends of the earth. God's dream for his people led to our salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. Their dream was just having their country back. God's dream was to bring all peoples together in Christ. I had so many dreams of my own. Small town pastor. Perfect family of 2 kids, maybe 3. Being a pastor of a cardinal Episcopal parish someday. And now I'm a Catholic church planter. And I couldn't be happier and more overjoyed at what God has done for us. Remember, whatever your greatest dreams are, God's are always greater. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. What a beautiful story. This is such a good reminder that God's call on our life is not necessarily always comfortable.
No.
But it's always exciting.
Absolutely.
I think you described that very well. God never fails to equip us so that we can do his will. So thank you again, Father.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Following the song, we would like to invite you to go over to the hospitality room for some refreshment and hospitality. And also, as you pass through the entryway, in the back, you can pick up a flyer. And that flyer announces our November event. And the speaker will be David Huber. And thank you all for coming once again.